You are not the woman in this photograph." Nathan Walker's hand trembled as he held it up beside the stranger standing before him at the depot, and Evelyn Brooks did not flinch. "No," she said, steady as stone. "I am not her. I am her sister, sent to keep a promise she broke. Send me back if you must, but I will not lie to you to stay." A cowboy with a dead man's eyes and a grave he never got to mourn. A woman wearing another bride's debt like a noose around her neck. Neither knew this broken bargain was about to become the only true thing either of them had left. Subscribe now and comment your city. Let's see how far this story travels together. The morning her sister disappeared, Evelyn Brooks was the one who found the empty bed. She stood in the doorway of the room they had shared their entire lives, staring at sheets still rumpled from a body that was no longer there. And for one terrible second, she let herself believe that Charlotte had simply gone to fetch water or feed the chickens, or do any of the 100 small chores that filled their mornings. Then she saw the note. It was folded into a careful triangle and propped against the wash basin, written in Charlotte's looping, hurried hand, and Evelyn's fingers shook so badly when she picked it up that she had to read it twice before the words made sense. "I cannot do this, Evie. I cannot marry a stranger I have never seen in a place I have never been for money. Papa already spent before I even agreed to go. I am sorry. I know what this means for the family. I know what it means for you. But I would rather be poor and free than rich and trapped in a marriage I never chose. Forgive me." See, Evelyn's first instinct was to laugh, a short, disbelieving sound that startled her in the empty room, because surely this was a joke. Surely Charlotte would walk through that door any moment with her bright eyes and her easy smile and say, "You should have seen your face." But the silence stretched on, and the laugh died in her throat, and the paper in her hand felt suddenly heavier than anything she had ever carried. Charlotte. Her own voice sounded strange to her, too thin for the size of the dread opening up in her chest. She ran. Down the narrow staircase through the kitchen, where the fire had not yet been lit, out into the yard, where the morning mist still clung low to the grass, calling her sister's name into air that gave no answer back. She checked the barn. She checked the well. She checked the path that led toward the Hendricks farm, where Charlotte sometimes went to talk with the boy she fancied the one their father had forbidden her to marry because he owned no land and would never own any. Nothing. Charlotte was gone, and she had taken with her the small carpet bag that held her good dress, and she had left behind everything else, including the obligation that was supposed to be hers. Evelyn was still standing in the yard, the note crumpled now in her fist, when she heard her father's heavy footsteps coming around the side of the house, and she turned to see him, already half-dressed, suspenders hanging loose at his hips. His face still creased with sleep, until he saw her expression, and something in him went very still. "Where's Charlotte? Papa, where is your sister Evelyn?" She held out the note because she did not trust her own voice to say the words, and she watched her father's face change as he read it, watched the color drain out of it, and then flood back in a deep, furious red that frightened her more than his shouting ever had. "She's run off. It seems so. With the Hendricks boy." "I don't know, Papa. The note doesn't say." Her father crushed the paper in his hand and turned in a slow, helpless circle, looking at the house, the barn, the road, as though one of them might give him an answer that made this not true. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something low and ragged that Evelyn had never heard from him before. "Do you understand what she's done? Do you understand what this means? I understand she didn't want. It is not about what she wanted." His shout sent a flock of birds scattering up out of the elm tree by the fence, and Evelyn flinched back a step before she could stop herself. "That money is spent, Evelyn. Every dollar of it. The roof, the seed for spring planting your mother's medicine, it's gone, and there is no getting it back, unless that train ticket gets used by somebody wearing your sister's name." The words took a moment to land, the way a blow sometimes does before the pain catches up to it. And when they did land, Evelyn felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her feet. "What are you saying?" "You know what I'm saying." "Papa, I have never even seen a photograph of this man. I don't know his name beyond what's on the letters. His name is Nathan Walker, and he is expecting a bride to step off that stage in 11 days' time, and if no bride steps off, he has every right by law and by contract to demand his money, returned money this family does not have and cannot get. Evelyn felt her chest tighten the early morning air, suddenly too thin to fill her lungs properly, and she looked past her father toward the house where her mother had not yet come outside, where the curtains in the front room hung still and undisturbed. And she understood with a sick, sinking certainty that her mother already knew that her mother had perhaps known for longer than anyone had told her. "Mama," she said, "does Mama know about this?" Her father's silence was answer enough. "You'd discussed this, before Charlotte ever ran. You'd already decided that if she balked, We discussed contingencies, Evelyn, as any sensible family must. I am not a contingency. You are my daughter, and this family is drowning, and I am asking you to throw us a rope." His voice cracked on the last word, and for just a moment Evelyn saw something in his face that was not anger at all, but a fear so deep and so old that it frightened her more than anything else that morning had brought. "I have buried 2 children in that churchyard, Evelyn. I have watched your mother go without medicine she needed because we hadn't the money for the doctor's visit. I am asking you. I am not commanding you. I am asking because I do not know what else to do." Evelyn stood there a long moment, the note still crumpled in her hand, her sister's careful handwriting pressed into her palm like a brand. And she thought of every quiet sacrifice she had already made in 24 years of being the elder daughter. The suitors, gently discouraged, because the farm needed her hands more than it needed her, married the new dresses that always went to Charlotte first, because Charlotte was the pretty one. The dreams she had folded up small and put away in some back drawer of her heart, because somebody in this family had always needed to be sensible, and that somebody had always been her. "If I go," she said slowly, "I go as myself, not pretending to be her. I will not lie to this man about who is standing in front of him." Her father's relief was so immediate and so total that it was almost its own kind of insult. "Evelyn, I mean it, Papa. I won't deceive him. If he wants to send me back the moment he sees I'm not Charlotte, that is his right, and you will have to find some other way to make peace with Mr. Walker. But I will not start a marriage, or even a pretense of one, with a lie. You understand, he may refuse you. He may demand the money back regardless. I understand that better than you do, since I am the one who will be standing in front of him when he makes that decision." There was no more arguing after that, only the terrible, practical business of packing a bag in a few short hours, of her mother emerging finally from the front room, with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, pressing a small cloth bundle into Evelyn's palm, a brooch that had been her grandmother's, the only thing of value she had left to give. "I am sorry," her mother whispered, and Evelyn could not tell if she was apologizing for the silence of that morning, or for 24 years of quietly choosing Charlotte first, or for handing her elder daughter over to a stranger 1,100 miles away, because there was nothing else left to give. "I know, Mama. You don't have to forgive me. I'm not doing this for forgiveness." Evelyn closed her hand around the brooch, felt its small cold weight settle into her palm like a promise she did not yet understand. "I'm doing it because somebody in this family has to be the one who keeps her word, even when it isn't hers to keep." The stagecoach to the rail junction left 2 days later, and Evelyn sat with her forehead against the window glass and watched the only home she had ever known shrink into the distance behind her. And she did not cry, because crying felt like something she did not have the luxury of doing anymore. The journey west took the better part of 9 days. Stagecoach to rail to a junction so small it barely deserved the name. Then, a final 2-day coach ride into territory that grew wilder and emptier with every passing mile, until the farms of Missouri were nothing but a green memory, and the land outside the window had turned to high golden grass and distant blue mountains that seemed to watch the coach's slow progress with an indifference Evelyn found almost comforting. There was no one to perform for out here, no one to disappoint. Just sky and grass and the rattling wheels carrying her toward a man who did not know her name. She had brought letters with her, 3 of them, all addressed to her sister, all written in a hand that was plain and careful, and utterly without flourish, the hand of a man unused to writing more than he had to. She read them so many times over those 9 days that she had them by memory before the coach ever reached Wyoming territory. I am not a man given to fine words. Miss Brooks and I will not pretend to be one now. I had a wife once. The war took something from me that I have not gotten back, and I will tell you plainly that I am not the husband a young woman dreams of. But I have land and a sound house, and I will treat you with respect, which is more than some men offer. If that is enough, write back and tell me when to expect you. There was something in that bluntness that Evelyn found herself returning to, turning over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by handling. He had not promised love. He had not promised romance or charm or any of the things a younger, more hopeful version of herself might once have wanted. He had promised respect and land and honesty about his own broken pieces, and somehow that honesty felt like the only solid thing in a journey built entirely out of pretense. I am not what he is expecting either, she thought, watching the grass roll by in endless gold waves. Perhaps that makes us even. But she knew, even as she thought it, that it did not make them even at all. Charlotte's photograph had been sent west months ago, a careful posed portrait taken in their Sunday best. Charlotte's bright eyes and easy smile captured in silver and shadow, tucked into an envelope, along with a letter that promised a particular woman, a specific face, a known quantity. Nathan Walker was expecting that woman to step off the stage. He was not expecting Evelyn. The depot in Cheyenne was smaller than she had imagined, and louder than she was prepared for. A chaos of shouting porters, stamping horses, the metallic shriek of the rail line, and beneath it all, a current of dust that seemed to coat everything, every surface, every breath she drew. She stood on the platform with her single carpet bag clutched in both hands, scanning the crowd of waiting men, and her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her wrists, in the soles of her feet. What does he look like? What if he doesn't come? What if he takes one look at me and turns around and walks away before I even have the chance to explain? And then she saw him. There was no mistaking which man was Nathan Walker, because he was the only one standing perfectly still while everyone else moved around him. A tall man, broad through the shoulders in the particular way of someone who had spent years doing hard physical work. His hat pulled low enough that she could not see his eyes, until she was nearly upon him, his jaw set in an expression that was not quite a frown, but held none of the eagerness she might have expected from a man meeting his bride for the first time. He had Charlotte's photograph in his hand. Evelyn watched him glance down at it, then up at the disembarking passengers, then down again. His brow furrowing slightly as he searched the crowd for a face that was not there. She made herself walk toward him. Every step felt enormous, deliberate, the way steps feel in a dream, where the ground refuses to cooperate. Mr. Walker, Mr. He looked up, and for the first time she saw his eyes, a pale, weathered gray, the color of a sky before a storm, and she watched those eyes move from her face down to the photograph in his hand, and back again, watched the confusion gather there like clouds building on the horizon. You are not the woman in this photograph. It was not a question. His voice was low and even, but there was an edge underneath it, something coiled and wary. And Evelyn understood in that instant that this was a man who had already been disappointed by life, in ways that had taught him to expect more of the same. She did not look away. Did not let her voice shake, though everything inside her was shaking. No, she said, I am not. Silence stretched between them, thick and terrible, while the depot churned on around them as if nothing of consequence were happening at all. Porters hauling trunks, a child crying somewhere behind her, a train whistle screaming its arrival down the line. Then who are you? My name is Evelyn Brooks. I am Charlotte's elder sister. His jaw tightened. And where is Charlotte? Gone. The word came out steadier than she expected. She left the morning she was meant to travel here. I don't know where she is now, only that she did not wish to marry a man she had never met, and I do not blame her for that. You don't blame her. Something flickered across his face, not quite anger, not quite disbelief. Something more complicated than either. And yet here you are in her place. My father had already spent the money you sent. All of it. There was no way to return it, and no way to feed my family through the winter without it. I am not going to stand here and pretend that isn't a sordid, ugly reason to put a stranger on a stagecoach. It is. I knew it when I boarded, and I know it now. So you came to collect a debt your father owed. I came, Evelyn said, and here her voice did shake just slightly, just enough that she heard it and hated it. Because someone in my family needed to keep their word, even if it wasn't theirs to keep in the first place. I will not lie to you, Mr. Walker. I am not the bride you were promised. I am not Charlotte. I don't know if I am even a woman you would have chosen given the choice. But I am standing here, and I am telling you the truth before you've spent a single dollar more or wasted a single hour more on a lie. You may send me back on the next stage if you wish. I would understand it completely. Nathan Walker said nothing for a long moment. He looked at her. Really looked the way a man might examine a horse he was considering buying, or a fence line he was considering mending, assessing rather than admiring, and Evelyn made herself hold still. Under that gaze, made herself not flinch or look away, because whatever else was true, she had not come 1,100 miles to flinch now. You could have lied, he said finally. Claimed to be her, banked on me not looking too closely at an old photograph. I could have. Why didn't you? Because a marriage that starts with a lie is a marriage that will end in one, and I have no interest in spending however many years I have left paying for a deception on my wedding day. Something shifted in his expression. Then, not quite a softening, but a kind of recalculation, as though she had just answered a question he had not asked aloud. You're not what I expected, he said. No, I imagine I'm not. That's not necessarily a complaint. He turned then, without further explanation, and began walking toward a wagon hitched at the edge of the depot yard, and Evelyn stood frozen for a moment, uncertain whether she was meant to follow, or whether this was simply how the rejection would happen, a slow walking away, a refusal too proud to be spoken aloud. Mr. Walker. He glanced back over his shoulder. You coming, or are you planning to stand in this depot until the next train carries you home? Her feet moved before her mind caught up to them. The wagon ride out to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and for most of it, neither of them spoke at all. The silence broken only by the creak of wheels and the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves against hard-packed earth. Evelyn used the silence to study him sideways, the way she might study a wild animal she did not yet trust. The set of his shoulders, the careful, economical way he handled the reins, the small scar that ran along his jawline that she found herself wondering about and did not dare ask. It was Nathan who finally broke the quiet, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. You said your father spent the money. Yes. On what? The roof. Seed for spring. My mother's medicine. Evelyn kept her voice flat factual, because there was no version of this story that did not sound like an accusation, and she did not want him thinking she had come here to ask for his pity. We are not a wealthy family, Mr. Walker. We were drowning before your letter ever arrived, and your money was the only rope thrown to us. I understand that doesn't make this fair to you. I'm only explaining why it happened. I see. You're angry. I'm not angry. You have every right to be. He was quiet a moment, his jaw working, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone lower, rougher around the edges. I'm not angry at you, Miss Brooks. I sent for a wife because I was tired of an empty house, and what I got instead was proof that I was right to expect disappointment. That's not a new feeling for me. I've had a great deal of practice with it. Something in the way he said it flat, resigned utterly without self-pity, made Evelyn's chest ache in a way she had not expected. What happened to you? The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately wished she could pull it back. I'm sorry. That's not my business. No, he agreed. It isn't. They rode another mile in silence before he spoke again. And when he did, his voice had a careful, distant quality, like a man describing something that had happened to someone else. I had a wife, before the war. We were married 3 years before I went east to fight, and when I came back, she was gone. Fever took her the second winter I was away. I wasn't there to bury her. I wasn't any of it." He paused, his hands tightening slightly on the reins. "I came home to an empty house and a grave I'd never seen dug, and I have spent the better part of 10 years since then making my peace with silence. Because silence, at least, doesn't lie to you." Evelyn did not know what to say to that. So she said nothing, only let the weight of it settle between them, and she found herself thinking of her own mother's red-rimmed eyes, her own father's cracked voice in the gray morning light, and understood that grief, it seemed, was a language every family eventually learned to speak. "I'm sorry," she said finally, because it was the only true thing she had. Most people say that. I imagine most people mean it too. It doesn't fix anything, but I don't think it's meant to. He glanced at her, then just briefly those pale gray eyes unreadable, and something in his expression made Evelyn feel for the first time since stepping off the stage that perhaps she had not made a catastrophic mistake in coming here after all. The ranch house, when they finally arrived, was not what Evelyn had expected. She had braced herself for something crude and makeshift, a bachelor's neglect written into every corner. But what she found instead was a solid, well-built house gone quiet with disuse, clean lines, sturdy construction, the unmistakable signs of a man who took care of what was his, even when there was no longer any joy in the caring. It was, she thought, very much like Nathan Walker himself. Solid, careful, hollowed out by something that had nothing to do with neglect and everything to do with grief. He showed her inside without ceremony, gesturing at a small room off the kitchen. "You'll sleep there. There's a washroom out back. I'll have one of the hands bring water in the mornings." He paused at the doorway, his hand braced against the frame, and Evelyn watched him visibly gather himself before he spoke again. "I want to be plain with you, Miss Brooks, the way you were plain with me at the depot. All right? I am not in a position to simply send you home. The journey is long, the money is spent, and I won't pretend that turning you back out onto that stagecoach wouldn't be its own kind of cruelty, given everything you've just told me. But I am also not a man who enters into a marriage with a stranger he did not choose, regardless of how honest she's been with me." Evelyn's stomach tightened, bracing for whatever came next. "So here is what I am offering," he continued. "Stay 3 months. As my housekeeper, paid a fair wage, nothing more expected of you than honest work for honest pay. At the end of those 3 months, if neither of us has found a reason to think differently, you'll have enough money saved to go wherever you please, and we'll part as strangers who once shared a roof and nothing more. And if one of us does find a reason to think differently—" The question hung in the air between them, and Evelyn watched something flicker behind Nathan's careful, guarded eyes. Not quite hope, because hope was clearly a thing this man had buried alongside his wife, but something adjacent to it, something cautious and unnamed. "Then we'll discuss it when the time comes," he said. "Not before." "That seems fair?" "It's the best I have to offer." "It's more than I expected, Mr. Walker. I came here prepared to be sent away. I considered it." His voice was honest, almost brutally so. "Standing at that depot watching you walk toward me instead of the woman in that photograph, I considered putting you right back on that train and washing my hands of the whole arrangement." He shook his head slowly, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the gold grass hills rolling out beyond the glass. "But you told me the truth when a lie would have served you better. That's not nothing where I come from. That's not nothing at all." Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest, some knot she had been carrying since the moment she found her sister's empty bed, and she allowed herself just for a moment to breathe. 3 months, she said. 3 months. "And after that, whatever happens, happens." "Whatever happens, happens," he agreed. And for the first time since she had met him, the corner of his mouth moved in something that was almost nearly the ghost of a smile. "Welcome to the ranch, Miss Brooks. I hope you don't come to regret it." Evelyn looked around the quiet, careful house at the dust on the windowsills that spoke of a man too tired to notice at the cold hearth that had clearly not held a proper fire in longer than it should, at the bones of a home, waiting for someone to breathe life back into it. And something settled in her chest that felt against every reasonable expectation, almost like purpose. "I don't think I will, Mr. Walker," she said quietly. "I have a feeling we might both be exactly where we're supposed to be." He did not answer that. He only nodded once, picked up her carpet bag, and carried it through to the small room off the kitchen, and Evelyn stood alone for a moment in the front room of a stranger's house, 1,100 miles from everything she had ever known, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was no longer simply the sensible daughter sacrificing herself for everyone else's sake. She was someone new now, someone who had told the truth when the lie would have been easier, someone who had walked into a stranger's life with nothing but honesty as her offering, and had somehow impossibly been met with the same. Whatever the next 3 months held, she would face them as herself. That at least was no longer a question. Part 2. Lưu ý viết 6.000 đến 6.800 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng, đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần Hải Đất điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh, sửa lỗi AI kể theo ngôi thứ 3, tăng độ kịch tính, không viết lần man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang mực document mới 2 đến 3 phút, cần có mini climax và đắt 10 đến 15. Mini climax mỗi phần cứ 10 đến 12 phút, có một twist lớn sâu sắc, đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn, tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả, lưu ý không mô tả cảnh và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh cho tôi. Show more. The first morning, Evelyn woke before the rooster did. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar dark, listening to the unfamiliar silence, and for one disoriented heartbeat, she forgot entirely where she was. Forgot Missouri was 1,100 miles behind her. Forgot her sister's empty bed. Forgot the depot and the photograph and the gray-eyed stranger who had not sent her away. Then it all came rushing back at once, and she sat up so fast her head spun. 3 months. She had 3 months to prove that honesty was worth something, and she did not intend to waste a single hour of it lying in bed while the sun came up without her. By the time Nathan came in from the barn, she had the fire-built water heating and the makings of breakfast laid out across a kitchen that had clearly not seen a woman's hand in a very long time. He stopped in the doorway, hat still on, and looked at the scene in front of him with an expression Evelyn couldn't quite read. Somewhere between confusion and something softer he was working hard to suppress. "You didn't have to start this early. I told you I'd earn my wage, Mr. Walker. I intend to." "Nathan," he said, "if we're going to share a roof for 3 months, you may as well use my name." "Nathan, then." She turned back to the stove before he could see her smile, because something about hearing him offer that small piece of himself felt disproportionately important, like a door cracked open that had been sealed shut for years. "Evelyn will do for me as well." He grunted something that might have been agreement, and sat down at the table, and Evelyn set a plate in front of him, and watched out of the corner of her eye as he took the first bite and went very still. "Something wrong?" "No." He cleared his throat, looked down at the plate like it had personally surprised him. "I just can't remember the last time I ate something that wasn't burned on one side and raw on the other. I'm not much of a cook." "I noticed the state of your flour tin. That bad?" "There were weevils, Nathan." He actually laughed at that, a short rusty sound like a hinge that hadn't been used in a long while, and Evelyn felt a small, fierce satisfaction at having pulled it out of him. "I'll take that as a compliment to the eggs then," she said, "since it's clearly not a compliment to your housekeeping. Don't get used to the laughing. It doesn't happen often." "I'll consider it a personal challenge." Something flickered across his face at that surprise, maybe, or wariness. The look of a man unaccustomed to being teased and unsure whether he liked it, and he said nothing more. Only finished his breakfast in silence and went back out to the barn. But Evelyn noticed when she cleared his plate that it was scraped completely clean. The work did not slow after that first morning. If anything, it multiplied. The house had been left to itself for years, and every room told its own small story of neglect. Curtains gone gray with dust, a pantry stocked with the bare minimum of a man who ate to survive rather than to enjoy a sewing basket shoved into a corner, with thread gone brittle and a needle rusted nearly through. Evelyn attacked it all with a ferocity that surprised even her scrubbing floors, until her knuckles bled, beating rugs, until her arms ached, turning over the small kitchen garden behind the house that had gone to weeds, and coaxing it row by row back toward something that might one day grow food again. She found in the third week a chest in the back room that had clearly not been opened in years. Dust lay thick across the lid, and when she finally worked up the courage to lift it, she found women's clothing folded with obsessive care inside a wedding dress yellowed at the seams, a small embroidered shawl, a hairbrush with strands of pale hair still caught in its bristles. Her breath caught. She knew without being told exactly whose belongings these were. She was still kneeling there, the lid open, the shawl in her hands, when she heard Nathan's boots in the doorway behind her, and she turned to find him standing there with an expression that had gone completely white. "Nathan, I'm sorry I didn't know what this room was. I should have asked before I—" "It's fine." "It's clearly not fine. I'll close it. I'll put it back exactly as I found it." "Evelyn." Her name in his mouth stopped her cold. He crossed the room, slowly knelt beside the chest, and for a long moment simply looked at the contents without touching them, his jaw working, his eyes fixed and distant in a way that made her chest ache. "Her name was Sarah." "You don't have to tell me. I know I don't." He reached out finally and touched the edge of the shawl with 2 fingers, the gesture so careful and so reverent that Evelyn had to look away because it felt like witnessing something too private for an outsider's eyes. "I haven't opened this chest since I came home and found her gone. I told myself I would eventually, that I'd give her things to the church or to her sister or something, but every time I came close I just—" He stopped. His throat moved. "You couldn't?" Evelyn said softly. "I couldn't." He let go of the shawl, sat back on his heels, and for the first time since she'd met him, Nathan Walker looked less like a wall of careful stone and more like a man who had simply been holding his breath for 10 years straight. "I used to think keeping this chest closed meant keeping her close. But I think it just meant I never let myself finish grieving her at all. I just locked the grief in a room and stopped going in. You don't have to decide what to do with it today." "No." He stood brushing dust from his knees, and when he looked at her, his eyes had gone glassy in a way he was clearly fighting hard against. "But maybe it's time I stopped locking the door." He left the room without another word, and Evelyn sat alone beside the open chest for a long while afterward, her chest tight with something she didn't have a name for. Not pity, exactly, because pity felt wrong for a man who had survived 10 years of silence with this much dignity intact. Something closer to awe. Something closer to tenderness she had no right to feel for a man she had known less than a month. She closed the chest gently and did not mention it again. But that night, for the first time, Nathan stayed at the table after supper instead of disappearing immediately to the barn, and when Evelyn sat down across from him with her mending, he began haltingly to talk. It started small. A comment about the war dropped almost accidentally, like a man testing whether the floor beneath him would hold his weight. "I was at Antietam," he said, staring at the lamp flame rather than at her. "September of '62. I don't talk about it. I want you to know that's not because I'm trying to be mysterious. It's because there isn't a version of talking about it that doesn't make the room feel smaller. You don't have to talk about it with me. I know." He turned the coffee cup slowly between his hands. "But you sat there this afternoon and didn't run from Sarah's chest and didn't ask me a single question I wasn't ready to answer. And I find that makes a man want to talk even when talking is the last thing he's good at." So she let him. Night after night, in small pieces, he gave her fragments of the war. Not the battles themselves, not at first, but the smaller, sharper griefs around the edges. The friend who died 3 feet from him, and whose name he still said in his sleep, according to the ranch hands who'd shared a bunkhouse with him those first years home. The letters from Sarah that stopped arriving the winter she got sick, though he didn't know it was sickness, until he came home 8 months later to a grave he'd never seen them dig. The guilt, sharp, unrelenting, entirely irrational, and entirely unmovable, that he had survived a war that had taken so many better men and come home only to lose the one thing the war was supposed to protect. "I used to think if I'd been here," he said one night, voice low and rough, "I could have saved her, gotten her a real doctor, sat with her, something. You don't know that. I know it doesn't matter whether I know it or not. I believe it anyway most nights." Evelyn set down her mending and looked at him directly the way she had looked at him on that depot platform when she refused to flinch. "Nathan, you were 3 states away fighting in a war you didn't start for a country that needed you there. That isn't a failure of love. That's just the brutal arithmetic of bad timing, and you have spent 10 years punishing yourself for math you never had any control over." He looked up at her startled, and something in his face cracked open just slightly. Not collapsed, not broken, but cracked the way dry earth cracks before the rain finally comes. "Nobody's said that to me before. Maybe nobody's had the nerve. Or maybe," he said quietly, "nobody stayed long enough to learn it needed saying." The silence after that was different from every silence that had come before, it not empty, not strained, but full charged with something neither of them named aloud. And Evelyn found she had to look down at her mending to keep from saying something she wasn't ready to say either. It was nearly 6 weeks in when Silas Harper first rode onto the property, and Evelyn knew within 5 minutes of meeting him that she did not trust a single word out of his mouth. He arrived on a fine black horse, dressed sharper than any rancher had any business dressing on a Tuesday afternoon, and he swept his hat off his head with a flourish the moment Evelyn stepped out onto the porch to see who'd ridden up. "You must be Mr. Walker's housekeeper," he said, his smile wide and white and entirely too practiced. "I'd heard rumors, but rumors don't do you justice, Miss Brooks," Evelyn said, not offering her hand. "And you are Silas Harper. I run the spread 2 valleys over." He glanced past her toward the house, toward the barn, with an assessing look that made Evelyn's skin prickle, the same look she imagined a man might give a piece of land he was considering for purchase. "Nathan around. He's out with the herd. I can tell him you called." "You do that." Silas's eyes drifted back to her, lingering a beat too long. "Strange thing, a woman like you wasting your days keeping house for a man like Nathan Walker. Fellows barely said 3 words together since his wife passed. Seems an awful lonely arrangement for someone as lovely as yourself." "I'm well compensated, Mr. Harper, and I don't find honest work lonely." "No, I don't suppose a woman with your sense would." His smile sharpened slightly, took on an edge she didn't care for. "Still, if you ever find yourself wanting better company, or a situation with a bit more comfort to it, my door's always open." "I'll keep that in mind," Evelyn said in a tone that made clear she would do nothing of the sort. And Silas laughed, like she'd said something charming, rather than dismissive, tipped his hat and rode off without ever dismounting. When she told Nathan about the visit that evening, his jaw tightened in a way she hadn't seen before. "Stay clear of Silas Harper." "I had no intention of doing otherwise. There's something about that man I don't trust." "Your instincts serve you well, then." Nathan's voice had gone hard, careful in a different way than his usual carefulness, less wounded, more wary. "He's been trying to buy up land in this valley for 3 years running, mine included. Makes a habit of finding a man's weak spot and pressing on it until something gives. And what does he think my weak spot is? Loneliness, probably, or the promise of an easier life than this one." He looked at her, then something complicated moving behind his eyes. "Don't let him convince you that you deserve more than what you've got here, Evelyn. Not unless you actually believe it yourself." The way he said it, quiet, almost vulnerable, like a man bracing for an answer he was afraid to hear, made something tighten low in Evelyn's chest. "I don't need convincing of anything, Nathan. I know exactly what I have here, and exactly what it's worth." She didn't elaborate further, and he didn't ask her to, but the look that passed between them lasted a beat longer than either of them probably intended, and neither one was the first to look away. The gossip started not long after that, first as whispers at the general store, then as outright comments made to Evelyn's face when she rode into town for supplies. Town women pulling their children a little closer, town men giving her the kind of assessing look Silas had given her that first day, as though her presence on Nathan's ranch made her something other than respectable. "It isn't proper," she overheard one woman say to another outside the dry goods store, not troubling to lower her voice. A widower and an unmarried woman alone on that ranch with no chaperone and no wedding band between them. Whatever she's calling herself, everyone knows what that arrangement really is. Evelyn's spine went rigid, but she did not turn around, did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction, only finished her purchase and walked back out to the wagon, with her chin held level and her hands steady on the reins. And it was only once she was well clear of town that she let her shoulders drop, let the hurt she'd been holding back finally surface. She did not tell Nathan about it. Not at first. But word travels fast in small valleys, and it was barely a week later that he came in from town himself, jaw tight, eyes dark with something that looked dangerously close to fury. "You should have told me what they're saying. It's nothing I can't handle." "It's not nothing, Evelyn. They're saying things about your character that aren't true, and they're saying them because of an arrangement I asked you to agree to." He paced the length of the kitchen, hands flexing at his sides. "I should have thought of this. I should have considered what it would cost you being out here unmarried with a man like me." "A man like you," Evelyn repeated. "And what exactly is wrong with a man like you?" He stopped pacing, looked at her like the question had genuinely caught him off guard. "I'm not exactly the kind of company that improves a woman's reputation. Nathan." She set down the dish towel in her hands, crossed the kitchen, and stood in front of him close enough that she had to tilt her chin up slightly to meet his eyes. "I have spent 24 years being the sensible daughter, the overlooked daughter, the one nobody worried about because nobody expected much from her in the first place. I have had exactly one person in my entire life sit across a table from me and actually listen, not fix, not lecture, just listen, and that person is you. I don't much care what the women outside the dry goods store think my character is. I know what it is. And I know what yours is too, whatever this valley wants to believe instead." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped low, rough around the edges. "You're a remarkable woman, Evelyn Brooks. I'm a practical one. There's a difference. Not as much of one as you think." He reached out, almost without seeming to decide to, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers brushing her cheek for the briefest of moments before he caught himself and pulled back, clearing his throat, putting a careful step of distance between them. "I have chores yet?" "Nathan." "It's fine, Evelyn. I need a moment." He left through the back door, and Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen, with her hand pressed to the cheek. He'd touched her heart, hammering in a way that had nothing to do with anger at the gossiping women in town, and everything to do with the look that had been in his eyes just before he walked away. The gossip did not stop. If anything, it sharpened in the weeks that followed, fed in no small part by Silas Harper, who Evelyn began to suspect was doing more than his fair share to keep the rumors alive, dropping comments in town that painted Nathan as a man taking advantage of a desperate woman's circumstances, painting Evelyn as either a fool or something worse. She confronted him about it the next time he rode onto the property uninvited, as always, that same too-practiced smile on his face. "I hear you've had quite a bit to say about my situation, Mr. Harper." "Only concern Miss Brooks. A man worries about a woman in a vulnerable position. The only thing vulnerable about my position is how often you seem to find reasons to ride two valleys out of your way to discuss it." Evelyn kept her voice level, but there was steel underneath it now, steel that hadn't been there the first time they'd met. "I'd ask you to direct your concern elsewhere. I am neither desperate nor foolish, and I have grown rather tired of people who assume a woman working for her keep is the same as a woman selling her dignity. Silas's smile faltered just slightly, replaced for a flickering instant by something colder underneath. You've got quite a tongue on you. I've got quite a lot of patience too, Mr. Harper, but you're testing the limits of it. He laughed, recovering his charm like a man pulling a mask back into place, but his eyes had gone flat, and assessing again, and Evelyn watched him right away with the distinct uneasy feeling that she had made an enemy rather than simply deflected a nuisance. She mentioned it to Nathan that evening, and his expression darkened in a way that told her this wasn't the first time Silas Harper's friendliness had curdled into something with teeth. He doesn't take rejection well. Land women doesn't much matter to him. He wants what he wants, and he doesn't like being told no. Nathan's jaw worked. I should have warned you sooner. I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize for another man's behavior. No. But I can still be sorry you have to deal with it. There was something steady in the way he said it, protective but not possessive, careful in a way that made the difference clear. And Evelyn felt that same warm, dangerous loosening in her chest that she'd been trying with limited success to ignore for weeks now. It was a Tuesday evening nearly 2 months into her 3, when everything between them shifted from quiet undercurrent to something neither of them could pretend not to see. Evelyn had stayed up late mending a torn shirt by lamplight, and Nathan had come in later than usual from checking the hurt exhaustion written into every line of his body. And instead of disappearing toward his room, as he usually did, he sat down heavily across from her at the table and simply watched her work for a long moment in silence. You don't have to wait up for me, Martinez. I wasn't waiting. I was mending. She held up the shirt as evidence. Though I confess I did notice you were later than usual. Storm's coming. Could feel it in the air. Wanted to make sure the herd was settled before it broke. Is that what's keeping you up nights, the herd? He was quiet for a long moment, and Evelyn glanced up from her mending to find him watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before, open, unguarded, none of the careful wariness he usually kept wrapped around himself like armor. No, he said finally. That's not what's keeping me up. Her hands stilled on the fabric. Then what is... You know what, Evelyn? The lamp flickered between them, throwing shifting shadows across the table, and Evelyn set the mending down slowly, her heart climbing into her throat. Nathan, I told myself 3 months. A business arrangement, nothing more, and I meant it when I said it. I've spent 10 years telling myself I was done with this, with wanting something, with letting myself hope for something, because hoping is what gets a man hurt. His voice had gone rough, low, stripped of every careful wall he usually kept around it. And then you walked off that stagecoach and told me the truth when a lie would have served you better, and every single day since you've kept right on doing it. Telling the truth. Showing up. Not running from the things that scare you even when they should. He shook his head slowly like he was arguing with himself even as he spoke. I don't know what to do with that, Evelyn. I don't know what to do with you. You don't have to do anything with me, Nathan. I'm not a problem that needs solving. No. A ghost of a smile, small and helpless. You're not. That's rather the trouble. Evelyn's breath caught, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. The lamp flame steady between them, the storm Nathan had predicted, beginning to whisper against the windows in the first scattered drops of rain. I should go to bed, Nathan said finally, though he made no move to rise. You should. Evelyn agreed, equally still. Neither of them moved for a long moment more. When he finally did stand, it was slow, deliberate, and he paused beside her chair on his way past, his hand resting briefly lightly on her shoulder. Not a caress. Nothing improper. Just contact. Just the simple acknowledgement of two people who had stopped pretending the distance between them was as wide as they'd both claimed it to be. Good night, Evelyn. Good night, Nathan. He left her sitting alone at the table, the mending forgotten in her lap, her shoulder still warm from where his hand had rested. And outside, the rain began in earnest, drumming steady against the roof, and Evelyn sat listening to it for a long while before she finally found the will to move. Thinking of 3 months that had somehow, without her quite noticing how, stopped feeling like a countdown to an ending, and started feeling instead like the first slow chapters of something she was no longer certain she wanted to walk away from. Part 3. Lưu ý viết 6.000 đến 6.800 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh tập trung vào hành động cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần Hải đạt điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh sửa lời AI, kể theo ngôi thứ 3 tăng độ kịch tính, không viết lan man kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn, không nhảy sang mức document mới. 2 đến 3 phút cần có mini climax và đặt 10 đến 15. Mini climax mời, phần cử 10 đến 12 phút, có một twist lớn sâu sắc đan xen. Mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn, tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh cho tôi yêu cầu viết đủ số từ. Show more. The storm Nathan had predicted broke fully 2 nights later, and it broke far worse than either of them had imagined it could. Evelyn woke to the sound of thunder that didn't roll so much as crack a single violent splitting of the sky directly overhead, and she was on her feet before she was even fully conscious, her heart slamming against her ribs. The second flash of lightning lit the whole room white, and in that instant, she heard something else beneath the thunder, a sound that didn't belong to weather at all. Horses screaming. She was out of her room and into the main house before she'd even found her shoes. And she met Nathan already at the front door, half-dressed, his face lit by an orange glow that had no business being visible through the window at this hour. Nathan! Barn's on fire! 3 words, flat and terrible. And then he was gone out into the rain and the howling wind, and Evelyn stood frozen for exactly 1 heartbeat before her body caught up to the horror her mind was still refusing to fully accept. She ran after him. The barn was already a wall of orange and black. By the time she reached the yard, flames climbing the old dry timber faster than anything she'd ever seen. Smoke pouring upward to meet the storm clouds, as though the sky itself were trying to swallow the fire and failing. The horses were screaming inside, that terrible high human-sounding scream that horses only make when they understand with complete and total clarity that they are about to die. Nathan don't. But he was already running for the barn door, already wrenching it open against a wall of heat that staggered him backward half a step before he forced himself through it, and Evelyn's whole body went cold with a fear sharper than anything she'd felt in her entire life. Nathan. No answer. Just smoke and flame, and the horses in the rain hissing uselessly against a fire too large for weather to touch. She didn't decide to run in after him. There was no moment of choice in it at all. 1 second she was standing frozen in the yard, and the next she was moving her arm thrown up over her mouth and nose, the heat slamming into her like a physical wall, the instant she crossed the threshold. Nathan, where are you? Get back. Evelyn, get out. His voice from somewhere to her left, rough with smoke and strain, and she turned toward it and saw him wrestling with the stall door of the lead mare, the animal rearing and screaming and nearly trampling him in her panic. And Evelyn didn't think, didn't calculate, just grabbed the lead rope hanging from the next stall and ran toward him. I'm not leaving without you. This isn't the time to be stubborn. Then stop wasting breath arguing and help me get this door open. He stared at her for 1/2 second through the smoke, something flickering across his soot-streaked face that might have been fury, or might have been something far more complicated. And then he was moving again. Both of them working the stall latches together, freeing one horse and then another, slapping their flanks hard, to send them bolting out through the open door into the rain. 3 horses freed. Then 4. A beam cracked somewhere above them, the sound like a gunshot, and Evelyn's head snapped up just in time to see it give way entirely. Nathan, move! She shoved him hard with everything her body had in it, and he stumbled sideways half a step not far enough. The beam came down across his shoulder and pinned him beneath a tangle of burning timber, and his shout of pain was swallowed almost instantly by the roar of the fire, and Evelyn's whole world narrowed down to one single screaming thought. He's trapped. He's trapped, and the fire is spreading, and I am the only one who knows he's in here. Nathan. She was at his side in an instant, hands already on the beam, heat searing through her palms, even through the fabric of her sleeves wrapped around them. I need you to push when I lift. Can you push? Get out. Evelyn, get out. Now that's an order. I don't take orders from a man pinned under a burning beam. Her voice cracked with something that was equal parts terror and fury. On 3. 1, 2, 3. She heaved upward with every ounce of strength in her body, screaming with the effort of it, and felt the beam shift just barely, just enough. Push Nathan now! He pushed. Pain ripped through his shoulder so violently he nearly blacked out from it. But he pushed, and the beam lifted enough for him to drag himself free, and Evelyn dropped it the instant he was clear, stumbling backward as the flames roared higher where it landed. Can you walk? Evelyn, your hands. Can you walk? Yes, yes, go. She hauled him up by his good arm, and together, half running and half falling, they staggered out through the smoke and the flame and the screaming wreckage of the barn into the cold, hammering rain, and the moment they cleared the doorway, Nathan's legs gave out entirely, and he went down hard onto the wet ground, dragging Evelyn down with him. For a moment, neither of them moved. They simply lay there in the mud, and the rain chests, heaving the barn behind them, collapsing in on itself in a final thunderous roar of flame and falling timber. And somewhere in the dark, the 4 freed horses circled and whinnied, frightened but alive. Alive. They were alive. Your shoulder. Evelyn's voice came out raw, scraped down to almost nothing. Nathan, let me see your shoulder. It's nothing. It is decidedly not nothing. You were just crushed beneath a burning beam. Her hands were already moving over him in the dark, frantic searching for the extent of the damage, and when her fingers found the wrongness in the shape of his shoulder, he hissed sharply through his teeth and she froze. That's broken. Dislocated, maybe. I've had worse. You have not had worse, Nathan Walker. You have had a beam fall on you while you were trying to save horses from a burning barn, which is not a thing any reasonable person has had worse than... Evelyn. His good hand found her wrist in the dark, gripping it with surprising strength given everything his body had just survived. You came in after me. Of course I came in after you. I told you to get back, and I have never once in my entire life been particularly good at doing what I'm told. Her voice broke then, finally the adrenaline draining out and leaving raw terror in its place, and she pressed her forehead briefly against his chest, just for a moment, just long enough to feel his heart still beating beneath her cheek. I thought that beam had killed you. I thought, Nathan, I thought I was about to watch you die in there. I'm not dead. I know I can feel that you're not, but I need a minute because for about 4 seconds I genuinely believed... She couldn't finish it. Didn't need to. He understood. I'm here, he said quietly, his hand still wrapped around her wrist, the rain pouring down over both of them, the barn still smoldering behind them in the dark. I'm here, Evelyn. We're both here. The barn was a total loss by morning. Evelyn stood in the gray dawn light beside Nathan, who sat on an overturned crate with his arm bound tight against his chest in a makeshift sling, his face gray with pain and exhaustion, and together they looked at what remained a black smoking skeleton of charred timber, the air still thick with the bitter smell of burnt wood and wet ash. It's gone, he said very quietly. All of it. Nathan, feed for the winter, tools. The wagon was in there. His voice was flat, the voice of a man doing arithmetic. He already knew the terrible answer to. I don't have the money to rebuild before the snow comes. I barely had the money to make it through this winter as it was. Evelyn knelt down in front of him so she could see his face properly, ash-streaked and exhausted and stripped of every careful wall he usually kept around himself. We will figure it out. We. Yes, we. Unless you intend to send me packing now that there's no longer a barn left to clean. She tried for lightness and only partially succeeded, her own voice still rough from smoke. "I didn't pull you out from under a burning beam just to watch you give up on a roof over your head, Nathan Walker. We will figure this out." He looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving behind his exhausted eyes, and he reached up with his good hand and pressed it briefly against her cheek, leaving a streak of soot she didn't bother to wipe away. "I don't deserve you," he said roughly. "You're not required to deserve me. You're only required to let me help." A doctor was sent for from town, a half-day's ride each way, and arrived by mid-afternoon to set Nathan's shoulder properly, a procedure that left him pale and sweating, and biting down hard on a strip of leather to keep from crying out. Evelyn's hand gripped in his good one the entire time, her own knuckles white from the force of his grip. "Dislocated and a hairline fracture both," the doctor said afterward, packing up his bag. "He'll mend, but it'll be slow, and he won't be lifting much of anything with that arm for 2 months at the least. You'll need to keep him from doing anything foolish in the meantime." He glanced at Evelyn with a faint knowing look. "Though from what I hear about last night, foolish bravery seems to run in this household regardless of who's asking who to behave." Evelyn flushed and didn't argue the point. It was 3 days later, while Nathan was still confined mostly to a chair by the fire, his arm useless and his pride visibly chafing under the forced stillness, that a wagon rolled up the long drive that Evelyn did not recognize, and her stomach dropped the instant she saw who was sitting beside the driver, Charlotte. She was out of the wagon and across the yard before it had even fully stopped. Her face pale, her traveling dress wrinkled from what must have been days on the road, and Evelyn stood frozen on the porch. Every emotion she'd been holding at bay for 2 months rising up at once. Relief, fury, hurt, love, all of it, tangled together so tightly, she couldn't separate one thread from another. "Evie!" Charlotte stopped a few feet away, her hands twisting in her skirts, her eyes already brimming. "I heard about the fire. I heard you nearly—" Her voice broke. "I had to come." "You had to come now, 2 months after you left me to clean up the wreckage of your decision. You had to come now. I know I have no right to expect you to forgive me." "You're right, you don't." Evelyn's voice shook, 2 months of swallowed anger finally finding its way to the surface. "Do you have any idea what you did, Charlotte? You didn't just run from a marriage you didn't want. You handed your obligation to me without asking, without warning, without so much as a goodbye. And I had to decide in the space of one single morning whether to let our family starve or get on a stagecoach to marry a stranger 1,100 miles from everything I'd ever known. I know." "Do you? Because from where I'm standing you ran toward your own freedom and never once looked back to see what it cost the rest of us." Charlotte flinched like she'd been struck, and the tears finally spilled over, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "You're right. I was selfish. I was scared and selfish, and I told myself you'd understand, you always understand, you always forgive, because that's what you do, Evie. That's what you've always done. And I think somewhere underneath the fear, I knew that. I think I counted on it. I think I used the fact that you'd never let the family suffer as my excuse to run, and that's an unforgivable thing to have done to you. Then why are you here? Because I heard you nearly died saving a man's life in a burning barn, and I realized I don't even know who that man is. I don't know anything about the life I handed you. I ran from my own story and left you to live one I never even asked you about." Charlotte wiped at her face with the back of her hand, a gesture so achingly familiar from their childhood that something in Evelyn's chest cracked despite her anger. "I came because I needed to see you were all right. And because I needed to finally say I'm sorry to your face, instead of in a note I left for you to find after I was already gone." Evelyn stood there a long moment, the fury and the love wrestling each other for dominance in her chest, and finally she let her shoulders drop. "I nearly lost him," she said quietly. 3 nights ago, I watched a beam come down on him, and for 4 seconds I thought I was about to watch the kindest man I have ever known die in front of me, and do you know what? I thought Charlotte. In that moment, I thought this is the man I came 1,100 miles to marry under false pretenses, and somehow he has become the realest thing in my entire life. You love him. I don't know what I am anymore beyond exhausted and frightened and grateful that he's still breathing." Evelyn's voice cracked. "But yes, I think I do." Charlotte closed the distance between them then, and pulled her sister into an embrace, and Evelyn let her, both of them crying into each other's shoulders, in the middle of the yard, 2 months and 1,100 miles, and an entire stagecoach's worth of resentment, finally breaking apart into something that might eventually heal. "I am so sorry, Evie." "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me today." "No." Evelyn agreed, pulling back to look at her sister's tear-streaked face. "But I think I might eventually. You're still my sister Charlotte. That doesn't stop being true just because you broke my heart a little getting here." Charlotte stayed 3 days, and in that time, something between the sisters began slowly to mend, not all at once, not completely, but enough. Enough for Charlotte to sit beside Nathan's chair and thank him haltingly for taking in the sister she'd abandoned. Enough for her to help Evelyn salvage what could be salvaged from the barn's wreckage, her hands blistering alongside her sister's for the first time in either of their memories. Enough by the second evening for the two of them to sit together on the porch steps after supper, watching the sun go down and really talk, in a way they never quite had back home, where Charlotte had always been the favored one, and Evelyn had always been the steady one, and neither role had ever left much room for honesty between them. "Papa always made you the example," Charlotte admitted quietly, her knees drawn up to her chest. "Be more like Evelyn. Evelyn never complains. Evelyn always does what's needed. I think I resented you for it some days, for being so easy to rely on that nobody ever worried whether you wanted something different. I noticed. I'm sorry. I should have seen what that cost you. I was too busy being jealous of how good you were at it. There was nothing good about it, Charlotte. I wasn't easy because I didn't want things. I was easy because nobody asked, and I learned a long time ago that wanting things out loud in our house didn't get you very far." Evelyn looked out at the darkening hills, the ranch that had somehow impossibly started to feel like hers in the space of 2 short months. "I think that's part of why I didn't run that morning. Not just duty. I think some small, terrible part of me was almost relieved to finally have a reason to leave." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. "And now I think the reason found me instead of the other way around." Evelyn looked toward the house, toward the window, where she could see Nathan's silhouette in the lamplight. His arm still bound reading, or simply sitting with his thoughts. "I came out here believing I was sacrificing myself for the family. I don't think that's true anymore. I think I was walking toward exactly where I was always supposed to end up, and it just took losing everything familiar to get me there. He loves you, you know that, don't you? I've been here 3 days, and I've watched the way that man looks at you when he thinks no one's noticing. I don't know what he feels. We've never said it plainly. Maybe it's time someone did." Evelyn didn't answer that, but she didn't argue with it either, and when Charlotte left 3 mornings later, promising to write, promising to do better, promising in 100 small, unspoken ways to become the sister Evelyn had always deserved, Evelyn found herself standing in the yard a long while after the wagon disappeared down the drive, turning her sister's words over and over in her mind. Maybe it's time someone did. The weeks that followed were hard ones. Winter was coming fast now, the air sharpening with each passing day, and with the barn gone, and Nathan's arm still mending. The work of preparing the ranch for the cold season fell almost entirely on Evelyn's shoulders, and the 2 ranch hands Nathan kept on. She fell into bed each night bone-tired, in a way she'd never been back in Missouri. Her hands roughened, and her body aching, and yet she found strangely that she had never felt less like collapsing under the weight of it, because every evening after the work was done, there was Nathan healing slowly, growing steadily less stubborn about accepting help, and talking to her now with an openness that had nothing left to hide behind. It was on one such evening, the fire burning low, Nathan's sling finally off for the first time, though his arm still moved stiffly, that he set down the cup of coffee he'd been holding, and looked at her with an expression that made her chest go tight with anticipation. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, the way you've answered everything since the day you stepped off that stage. All right. 3 months was the arrangement. We're nearly there now. He flexed his bad arm, slowly wincing slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. I told myself when I made that offer that it was about being fair, giving you a way out if you needed one, and giving myself a way to keep from hoping for something I didn't think I deserved to hope for again. Nathan, let me finish. Please. His voice was rough raw in a way she'd never heard from him, not even in the depths of his worst stories about the war. I have watched you run into a burning building for me. I have watched you stand in this kitchen and tell an valley's worth of gossip to go straight to hell because you weren't ashamed of the truth. I have watched you forgive a sister who broke your heart because somewhere in you, you've got more grace than any person has a right to carry. And I am sitting here 3 days shy of the deadline I set for both of us, and I don't want it to end, Evelyn. I don't want you to walk away because the calendar says you're free to. Her breath had gone shallow, her hands trembling slightly where they rested in her lap. What are you saying? I'm saying I love you. The words came out unsteady, like a man crossing a bridge he wasn't entirely sure would hold his weight, but he said them anyway, fully without flinching. I'm saying, I think I've loved you since that first morning you scrubbed weevils out of my flour tin and made me laugh for the first time in 10 years. I'm saying the 3 months were never really about a trial period for you. I think they were about giving myself permission to feel something again, and you walked through that door and gave it to me whether I asked for it or not. Evelyn sat frozen for a moment, the fire crackling low beside them, the words she'd been too frightened to say, first finally rising up to meet his. I love you too, she said, and the relief of finally saying it aloud nearly undid her entirely. I have for weeks. I think I have since the night you told me about Sarah's chest and let yourself cry in front of me without apologizing for it. I came here a stranger wearing my sister's promise, Nathan, and somewhere along the way, I stopped being her substitute and started being exactly fully myself, and you are the reason that happened. You are the reason I know who I am now. Nathan crossed the small distance between them and knelt in front of her chair. His good hand reaching up to cradle her face, and for a long moment, he simply looked at her, something raw and unguarded and entirely undefended moving across his features. Stay, he said quietly. Not as my housekeeper, not because of any arrangement or any debt or any contract your father made before either of us had a say in it. Stay because you want to, because I am asking you freely with nothing left between us but the truth. Yes, Evelyn whispered, and the tears that had been building all evening finally spilled over. Yes, Nathan, I'll stay. He kissed her, then slow and careful, his good hand still cradling her jaw, and Evelyn felt every mile of that long stagecoach journey, every ounce of guilt and fear she'd carried west, finally settle into something that felt for the first time in longer than she could remember entirely and completely, like peace. But even as the kiss deepened, even as Evelyn let herself believe just for a moment that the hardest parts of this story were finally behind them, a sound reached them from outside. Hooves on the drive, moving fast, far too fast for an evening visit, and Nathan pulled back sharply, his expression shifting instantly from tenderness to alarm. That's not one of my hands. Evelyn's heart lurched. Silas. They were both on their feet before the rider even reached the porch, and the look on Nathan's face told Evelyn with sickening clarity that whatever was coming through that door next was not going to be good news. Part 1. Lưu ý viết 6.000 đến 6.800 từ. Liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần hại đạt điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh, sửa lời AI, kể theo ngôi thứ 3, tăng độ kịch tính, không viết lân man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang mức document mới 2 đến 3 phút. Cần có mini climax và đạt 10 đến 15 mini climax, mỗi phần cứ 10 đến 12 phút. Có một twist lớn sâu sắc đan xen, mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn, tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh cho tôi yêu cầu viết đủ số tự. Show more. It was not Silas himself who came pounding up the drive, but his foreman, a wiry man named Decker, who Evelyn had seen once or twice in town and never trusted his horse lathered with sweat. His voice cracking with what sounded almost like urgency as he pulled up short of the porch. "Walker, Mr. Walker, you need to hear this before the bank does." Nathan stepped out onto the porch, his expression already hardening. "Hear what Decker, Mr. Harper's filed a claim against this land. Says there's a debt outstanding from before the war, something about your father's account, that was never settled, and he's got papers that say it transfers to him if it goes unpaid through the territorial office." Decker swung down from his horse, clearly uncomfortable with the role he'd been sent to play. "He means to foreclose, Mr. Walker. Wanted you to hear it from someone before the sheriff comes round with the papers tomorrow." The color drained slowly from Nathan's face. "That's not possible. That debt was settled years ago. I have the papers myself in my father's own hand." "I'm only telling you what Mr. Harper told me to tell you. I don't know the particulars." "There are no particulars because there's no debt." Nathan's voice had gone low and dangerous in a way Evelyn hadn't heard from him before, not even in the burning barn. "This is Harper trying to take my land out from under me because I won't sell it to him outright, and he knows full well I can't fight a legal claim with the barn just burned and my arm barely healed." Decker had the decency to look ashamed, at least, before he climbed back onto his horse and rode off into the dark, leaving Nathan and Evelyn standing alone on the porch with the night closing in around them, and a threat hanging over everything they'd just promised each other not 20 minutes before. "Nathan." Evelyn's hand found his arm. "Tell me this isn't possible. Tell me he can't actually do this. I don't know what he can do." Nathan's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the dark road where Decker's dust still hadn't fully settled. "I know my father paid that debt the year before he died. I remember it. I remember him riding into town with the money himself. But if Harper's got paper that says otherwise and the right official willing to look the other way, then we find your father's records, tonight if we have to. Evelyn, it's nearly midnight, and the sheriff is coming with papers tomorrow, which means we don't have the luxury of waiting for a more convenient hour to start looking." She was already moving toward the house, toward the small writing desk in the corner, where Nathan kept what little correspondence and record-keeping the ranch required. "Where would your father have kept something like that? A receipt, a deed, anything with his signature and Harper's name on it?" Nathan stood for a moment, visibly startled by the speed of her resolve. And then something in his expression shifted, gratitude maybe? Or simple relief at not having to face this alone, and he followed her inside. "There's a strongbox. In the floor of the old tack room, the part of the barn that—" He stopped short, his face going gray. "The part of the barn that burned." Evelyn's stomach dropped along with his voice. "Nathan, if it was in the tack room, Evelyn, it's gone. Burned with everything else." He sat down heavily at the desk, his head dropping into his good hand, and for the first time since she'd met him, Nathan Walker looked entirely, completely defeated. "He's going to take the land. After everything. After the fire, after Sarah, after all of it. Harper's finally going to win, and there isn't a single thing I can do to stop him. No." Evelyn knelt in front of him, taking his face in both hands, forcing him to look at her. "I do not accept that. Not after everything we have already survived together. There has to be another copy. A territorial office keeps land records, doesn't it? Deeds, transfers, debt settlements. Surely a payment of that size would have been recorded somewhere beyond just your father's private strongbox." Nathan looked up at her, something flickering back to life behind his exhausted eyes. "The county recorder's office, in Cheyenne." "Then that's where we start. First thing tomorrow before the sheriff even arrives with Harper's papers." "Evelyn, that's a full day's ride each way. The sheriff could be here before we've even—" "Then I will go, and you will stay here and make certain nothing happens to this ranch while I'm gone." She said it with a certainty that left no room for argument, the same certainty that had carried her into a burning barn 3 weeks before. I am not going to sit here and watch a man like Silas Harper take what is yours through fraud and intimidation, not after everything you have already lost. I refuse. You'd do that for me. I would do that for us, Nathan. There's no version of my future anymore that doesn't have this ranch and you in it. Her voice softened, even as her resolve held firm. Let me help. Truly help the way you let me help pull you out from under that beam. Don't shut me out of this fight just because it's bigger than weevils in a flour tin. A ghost of a smile crossed his exhausted face despite everything. I seem to recall you weren't invited into that fight. You simply ran in after me. And it worked out rather well, as I recall. She left before dawn, riding the fastest horse the ranch had left her body aching from too little sleep and too much fear. And the ride to Cheyenne felt longer than the entire stagecoach journey that had first brought her west. She rehearsed what she would say to the recorder 100 times in her head, turning over every possible argument, every possible obstacle, and arrived at the small territorial office with dust caked into every fold of her clothing, and a desperation she fought hard to keep out of her voice. The clerk behind the counter was an older man with spectacles perched low on his nose, and he listened to her request with the slow, methodical patience of someone who had clearly seen every kind of land dispute the territory had to offer. Walker, you said old Henry Walker's boy. Yes, Nathan Walker. I need any record of a debt settlement between Henry Walker and a Mr. Silas Harper, or perhaps the Harper family more broadly from before the war, possibly 1859, 1860. The clerk disappeared into a back room, lined floor to ceiling with ledgers, and Evelyn stood at the counter, with her heart hammering every minute feeling like an hour. Every creak of the old floorboards behind her, making her flinch toward the door, in case it was somehow already too late. When he finally returned, he was carrying a thick, dust-covered ledger, and Evelyn's breath caught as he laid it open on the counter and began running a finger down the columns of careful, faded handwriting. Here, he tapped the page. March of 1860. Henry Walker payment in full to Edmund Harper, $400 debt satisfied and recorded. Edmund Harper's mark right there beside it, witnessed by the territorial magistrate at the time. Edmund Harper, Evelyn repeated. Not Silas. Silas would be Edmund's son, I'd guess, if he's claiming the debt now. But it doesn't matter whose name is on the claim today, Miss. If the original debt was settled and recorded as this ledger plainly shows, it was, there's no legal standing for anyone to revive it. Settled debts don't transfer. They're finished business. Relief crashed over Evelyn so suddenly, her knees nearly buckled, and she gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. I need a copy of this. An official one, something I can carry back with me today. Something that will hold up against whatever papers Mr. Harper is presenting to the sheriff. I can have a certified copy drawn up within the hour. Cost you a small filing fee, but given what's at stake, I'd say it's the cheapest insurance you'll ever buy. While she waited, Evelyn paced the small office, her mind racing through everything that still had to happen, the ride back, the timing. Whether the sheriff would already be at the ranch by the time she arrived, whether Harper had some other trick still waiting beneath whatever he'd already played. She had learned over these past months that men like Silas Harper rarely staked everything on a single lie. There was almost certainly something else coming. She was right to worry. When the clerk returned with the certified copy carefully folded and sealed, he hesitated before handing it over, an odd expression crossing his weathered face. Miss Brooks, was it? You said the claim was filed by Silas Harper specifically. Yes. Why? Only that this isn't the first complaint I've heard about that name this month. He lowered his voice slightly, though there was no one else in the office to overhear. Had another rancher in here 3 weeks back, asking after a similar matter. Seems Mr. Harper's been filing claims against more than one piece of land in that valley, all citing old debts that conveniently can't be verified, because the supporting paperwork happened to burn or go missing, or simply never existed in the first place. He met her eyes meaningfully. You might want to ask yourself, Miss Brooks, whether that barn fire was entirely an act of God. The words landed like a physical blow, and Evelyn felt the floor tilt beneath her. You think Harper set the fire? I'm not in the business of accusing a man without proof. I'm only in the business of noticing patterns, and that's a pattern I've noticed 3 times now in as many months." The clerk slid the certified document across the counter. "I'd be careful if I were you. A man willing to burn another man's barn to clear the way for a false claim is a man willing to do considerably worse if he feels cornered." Evelyn rode back to the ranch with the certified document clutched against her chest beneath her coat, the clerk's words echoing in her mind with every mile, every hoofbeat, every mounting fear that she might already be too late. She arrived back at the ranch as the sun was beginning its long slide toward the horizon, and her heart seized the instant she saw the sheriff's horse already tied at the porch rail. Silas Harper himself standing in the yard with a folded document in his hand and an expression of barely concealed triumph on his face. Nathan stood opposite him, his jaw set, his bad arm held stiffly at his side, every line of his body radiating the kind of controlled fury that came from a man who had already lost too much to lose gracefully again. "Mr. Walker," the sheriff was saying as Evelyn swung down from her horse, "I understand this is difficult news, but Mr. Harper's claim does appear to be in order. Without documentation proving the original debt was settled, the law requires, I have documentation." Every head in the yard turned toward her, and Evelyn walked forward with the certified copy held out in front of her like a shield. Her legs trembling from the long ride, but her voice steady, clear, carrying across the yard with a force that surprised even her. Silas's expression flickered, the triumph in his eyes faltering for just a moment before he caught himself. "And what exactly is that, Miss Brooks?" A certified copy from the Territorial Recorder's Office in Cheyenne documenting that Henry Walker satisfied his debt to Edmund Harper in full in March of 1860, witnessed and recorded by the territorial magistrate of the time. She handed it to the sheriff, who unfolded it slowly, his eyes moving down the page, his brow furrowing as he read. "There is no outstanding debt, Sheriff. There never has been. Whatever claim Mr. Harper has presented to you is built on a lie." "This is outrageous," Silas snapped, though something in his voice had gone thin brittle, the confidence draining out of it. "That document is decades old. It could easily be certified by the territorial recorder himself this very morning, with his own seal." The sheriff's voice had gone hard, his eyes lifting from the document to fix on Silas with an entirely new weight of suspicion. "Mr. Harper, this is a serious matter. Filing a fraudulent claim against another man's land is not a small offense in this territory." "I was not aware the original debt had been settled. My father's records were incomplete." "Your father's records," Evelyn interrupted. "Or your own convenient choice to overlook the records that didn't suit your purposes, because I spoke with the recorder myself, Sheriff, and he informed me that Mr. Harper is not the only rancher in this valley who has suddenly discovered old, unverifiable debts in the months since their barns happened to burn down." The yard went utterly silent. Silas's face had gone white, then mottled red, his composure cracking entirely for the first time since Evelyn had met him. "That is a baseless accusation." "Is it?" Nathan's voice was low, dangerous, every bit of the controlled fury he'd been holding finally finding its target. "Because my barn burned 3 weeks ago in a storm that, now that I think on it, conveniently destroyed the one piece of paper that would have disproven your claim before you ever filed it." Strange thing that Silas, almost as if someone knew exactly what needed to disappear. "You have no proof of that?" "No," Evelyn said evenly. "Not yet. But the recorder in Cheyenne mentioned 3 other ranchers with the same story, and I suspect a thorough investigation by the Territorial Marshal's Office would turn up considerably more than coincidence." The sheriff, who had been listening to all of this, with a steadily darkening expression, folded the certified document carefully and tucked it into his coat. "Mr. Harper, I'm going to need you to ride into town with me. This claim is void as of this moment, and given what's just been raised, I think the Marshal's office is going to have considerable interest in your recent filings across this valley." "This is absurd. I am a respected landowner." "You're a man who just got caught filing a fraudulent claim in front of witnesses, Mr. Harper, and I'd suggest you stop talking before you make your situation any worse than it already is." Silas's eyes swept the yard one final time, landing on Evelyn with a look of such naked venom that she felt Nathan shift protectively closer to her side, and then without another word, he mounted his horse and rode off toward town, with the sheriff close behind the Triumph that had walked onto this property, barely an hour ago, utterly, completely extinguished. It was only once the dust of their departure had settled that Nathan turned to Evelyn, and the look on his face undid her entirely. "You rode to Cheyenne and back in a single day. I told you I would help. You didn't tell me you'd save the entire ranch in an afternoon." His voice cracked slightly, and he crossed the yard and pulled her into his arms, careful of his still healing shoulder, but holding her with an intensity that left no doubt about what he was feeling. "Evelyn, my God. I thought when I saw Harper standing there with that document, I thought we'd lost everything. I thought there was nothing left to do but watch him take the one thing I had left to give you. You don't give me a ranch, Nathan. You're not required to give me anything at all." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, her hands resting against his chest. "I came back today because I love you, and because I refuse to stand by and watch a man like Silas Harper destroy something we have both bled for, quite literally in your case, out of pure greed and spite. I love you," he said again, like he couldn't stop saying it now that the words were finally free. "And I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve a woman who rides 11 hours round trip to save my land, and still has the strength left to stand in that yard and dismantle a liar in front of the sheriff. You don't need to deserve me, Nathan. You only need to keep choosing me. That's all either of us can promise the other, choosing every day, even when it's hard." He kissed her, then slow and certain, the kind of kiss that held none of the uncertainty of their first 1 week before. And when he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with something that looked for the first time since she'd known him entirely unguarded. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of any arrangement, not because of any debt, not because your father needed money or because I needed a housekeeper. Marry me because I cannot imagine spending one more day of my life without you in it. And because you have shown me over and over exactly what it looks like to choose someone, truly choose them, when nothing is forcing your hand." Evelyn felt the tears come before she could stop them, 2 months of fear and grief and hard-won hope finally breaking loose all at once. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Nathan. 1,000 times yes." The weeks that followed moved with a different rhythm than anything that had come before. Not the frantic survival of the fire, not the desperate scramble to save the land, but something steadier, something that felt for the first time like the beginning of an actual life, rather than a series of crises to be endured. Word of Silas Harper's arrest spread through the valley faster than any fire could have, and with it came a quiet but unmistakable shift in how the town regarded both Nathan and Evelyn. The same women who had once whispered about impropriety outside the dry goods store now greeted Evelyn with something closer to respect, even in a few cases, open admiration, as the story of her ride to Cheyenne and her dismantling of Harper's scheme took on a life of its own, growing slightly more dramatic with each retelling, but never losing its essential satisfying truth. The marshal's investigation, as the sheriff had promised, turned up exactly what Evelyn had suspected: 2 other ranchers in the valley, with suspiciously similar claims, suspiciously similar fires, and a pattern of fraud that stretched back nearly 3 years. Silas Harper would not be troubling anyone in that valley again, not for a very long time. And the relief that settled over Nathan's shoulders in the wake of that certainty was visible in the way he carried himself, the way his laugh came easier, the way the careful, guarded wariness that had defined him when Evelyn first met him at that depot continued slowly to soften into something lighter. They began rebuilding the barn together, not alone, for neighbors who had once kept a careful gossiping distance now showed up with lumber and labor, freely given, the kind of community generosity that Nathan admitted quietly he had forgotten this valley was even capable of. "I'd stopped expecting people to show up for me," he told Evelyn one evening, watching the new frame of the barn rise against the darkening sky, half-built and full of promise. "After Sarah, after the war, I think I decided it was safer to expect nothing from anyone. Easier than being disappointed. And now, Now I've got half the valley out there hammering nails into my new barn, and a woman beside me who rode to Cheyenne and back to save what was left of it. And I think I'd forgotten what it felt like to have people actually choose to stand beside you." He looked at her, something soft and unguarded in his expression. "You did that, Evelyn. You didn't just save the land. You reminded this whole valley and me most of all what it looks like when people choose each other, instead of just enduring each other." Evelyn leaned into his side, careful of his still mending shoulder, and watched the frame of the new barn rise board by board against the sky, and felt for the first time since she'd boarded that stagecoach so many months ago, carrying her sister's broken promise that she had finally completely arrived exactly where she belonged. The wedding, they decided, would be small. Just the valley. Just the people who had shown up when it mattered. Just the truth of two people who had found each other through honesty instead of deception, through choice instead of obligation, through a barn fire and a fraud. And every hard thing in between that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, brought them closer together instead of tearing them apart. The wedding took place on a clear morning in early autumn, and Evelyn would later say it was the first day in her entire life when she had stood in front of people and felt no need to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. Charlotte came back for it, true to her word, arriving a full week early to help with every small preparation, and the two sisters spent that week stitching the hem of Evelyn's dress together at the kitchen table, the way they used to as girls, except this time the silence between them held none of the old resentment, only something easier, something mended. "I never thought I'd see you like this," Charlotte said quietly, biting off a thread. "Happy, settled, sure of yourself." "Neither did I. I used to think you didn't want things, Evie. I understand now, I just never gave you the room to want them out loud." Charlotte's eyes were glassy, but she kept her hand steady on the needle. "I'm glad you found this. I'm glad you found him. I just wish it hadn't cost you so much to get here." "It cost me a great deal," Evelyn agreed. "But I don't think I'd trade the path for an easier one, even if I could. I wouldn't have become this version of myself any other way." Their mother arrived 2 days before the ceremony, having scraped together just enough for train fare, and the moment Evelyn saw her step down from the wagon, thinner than she remembered, her hands trembling slightly the way they had that terrible morning, Charlotte ran something in Evelyn's chest, broke open all over again. "Mama, look at you." Her mother's voice was thick with tears before she'd even crossed the yard. "Look at what you built out here, Evelyn. I am so sorry I let you carry this alone. I am so sorry I never once asked what you wanted instead of simply telling you what we needed. You're here now. I should have been a different kind of mother to you. Braver. The kind who fights for her daughters instead of asking them to fight for everyone else." She took Evelyn's face in both hands, the way she had the morning Evelyn left. Except this time her eyes were clear, present, finally seeing her daughter fully, instead of simply needing something from her. "I am so proud of you. Not for the sacrifice. I am done being proud of you for sacrifice, Evelyn. I am proud of who you became in spite of it." Evelyn held her mother for a long while in the yard, the autumn sun warm on both their shoulders, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since she was a very young girl, learning long before she should have had to that her own wanting mattered less than everyone else's needing. It mattered now. It had always mattered. She understood that completely for the first time in her life. Nathan, for his part, spent that final week in a state of barely contained nervousness that Evelyn found endlessly endearing, given everything they had already survived together. He fumbled his way through final preparations on the new barn, now fully rebuilt, sturdier than the original, every neighbor who'd helped raise it, given a standing invitation to the wedding as thanks. He practiced his vows out loud while mending fence, not realizing Evelyn could hear him from the garden, his low voice rehearsing words that made her throat tighten every time a fragment carried on the wind. "You're going to wear a groove in that fence post talking to it instead of to me," she finally called out, unable to keep the smile from her voice, and Nathan startled so badly he nearly dropped his hammer. "You weren't supposed to hear that." "I've heard most of it, I'm afraid. Something about choosing you every day even when it's hard." His ears went red. It sounds better when I'm not being overheard mid-sentence. I rather liked it overheard. She crossed the yard and took his hands, calloused now from months of work that had nothing to do with the soft, sheltered life she'd once imagined for herself, and found she didn't miss that old imagined life even slightly. Save the rest for the day itself. I want to hear the whole thing properly in front of everyone the way it deserves to be heard. You're going to make me cry in front of the entire valley. Good. I intend to do the same. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and cold, the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharper, more vivid, more real. The valley turned out in force, not the careful gossiping distance of those first uncertain weeks, but genuine warmth neighbors who had hammered nails into the new barn frame, now arriving dishes and good wishes. The same women who had once whispered outside the dry goods store, now embracing Evelyn with tears in their eyes. And apologies they didn't quite know how to phrase, but offered anyway, through small kindnesses, through the simple act of showing up. Evelyn stood at the edge of the gathered crowd in her sister's careful needlework, her mother fussing with her veil, Charlotte gripping her hand so tightly it nearly hurt. And when the moment finally came to walk forward, she found she did not feel nervous at all. She felt instead a settled, bone-deep certainty that she had walked through fire quite literally to arrive at exactly this moment, and nothing about it felt like anything other than coming home. Nathan stood waiting for her, his bad shoulder fully healed, now his eyes already bright with emotion, before she'd even reached him, and when their hands finally joined, he leaned in close enough that only she could hear him. I told myself for 10 years I was done hoping for anything, he murmured. You walked off a stagecoach and ruined that plan completely. I'm not the least bit sorry. Neither am I, not for one single second of it. The ceremony itself was simple, unadorned. Exactly the kind of honest thing both of them had built their entire relationship around. No elaborate promises, no flowery language, just two people standing in front of a community that had watched them survive fraud and fire and gossip and grief, declaring plainly that they had chosen each other and intended to keep choosing each other for as long as they both lived. When Nathan finally said the words he'd been rehearsing all week to a fence post, his voice cracked on the third sentence, and he had to stop, swallow hard, start again, and Evelyn squeezed his hands and waited unbothered by the pause, because some things were worth a man taking his time to say properly. I spent 10 years believing the best parts of my life were already behind me, he managed finally. I want the whole valley to hear me say that I was wrong. The best part of my life is standing right here in front of me, and I intend to spend every day I have left proving that I know it. There was not a dry eye among the gathered crowd by the time the minister pronounced them married, and when Nathan kissed her soft, certain, utterly unhurried, despite the small crowd of witnesses, Evelyn felt the last lingering shadow of that terrible morning in Missouri. Her sister's empty bed, her father's cracked voice, finally completely lift away. She was not a substitute anymore. She had not been one for a long while now. She was simply fully, irrevocably herself, and the man she had just married had chosen exactly that. The months that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had quite known to hope for. The new barn stood strong against the winter winds. The herd grew steadily, and the house that had once held nothing but dust and silence and a locked chest of unspoken grief slowly filled instead with warmth, with Evelyn's cooking, with Nathan's increasingly frequent laughter, with the small accumulated evidence of two people building an actual life together rather than simply surviving alongside one another. Sarah's chest, the one Evelyn had stumbled upon that first month, no longer sat closed and untouched in the back room. Nathan had finally, with Evelyn's hand steady in his, gone through it properly, keeping a few small things that mattered. The brooch, a handful of letters, and giving the rest gently and with real peace, rather than avoidance, to Sarah's sister in town, who wept with gratitude rather than grief when she received them. I think I needed you to be there for that, Nathan admitted afterward, his arm around Evelyn's shoulders as they rode home in the wagon. Not because I couldn't have done it alone eventually, but because doing it with you made it feel like closing one door so I could properly walk through another instead of just losing something all over again. I'm glad I could be there for it. You've been there for nearly everything that's mattered since the day you stepped off that stage." He pressed a kiss to her temple, the reins loose in his hands, the autumn light gold and soft around them. "I keep waiting for the part where loving you stops feeling like a small miracle I don't entirely deserve. I don't think that part's coming." "Good. I'd be rather disappointed if it did." It was deep into winter, nearly a full year after Evelyn had first arrived carrying her sister's broken promise, when she discovered the news that would change everything yet again. She had been feeling unwell for several mornings, running a tiredness that sleep didn't seem to touch, a stomach that turned at smells that had never bothered her before. And it was the ranch's hired hand's wife, a kind, practical woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who had become something of a friend over the months, who finally said the words out loud that Evelyn had been too afraid to consider. "Evelyn dear, has it occurred to you that you might be expecting—" The question landed like a physical jolt, and Evelyn sat very still for a long moment, mentally counting back the weeks, the realization dawning slowly, and then, all at once. I hadn't let myself think it. We've only been married a few months." "A few months is plenty of time for a baby to get started, dear. I'd say it's worth finding out for certain, rather than wondering." The doctor confirmed it 3 days later, and Evelyn rode home from that appointment with her heart hammering so hard she could barely keep her hands steady on the reins. Turning the news over and over in her mind, trying to imagine how to even begin telling Nathan, a man who had spent 10 years believing the war had taken every chance he'd ever have at this particular kind of happiness. She found him in the half-finished addition to the barn, mending a section of fence in the cold afternoon light, and she stood watching him for a long moment before she found the words. "Nathan." He looked up immediately, alert to something in her tone. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She crossed the yard slowly, her hands clasped in front of her, her heart in her throat. "I went to see the doctor today." His face went instantly pale with worry. "Evelyn, are you ill?" "I'm not ill, Nathan." She took his hands in hers, looked up into his worried gray eyes, and let herself smile fully for the first time since she'd suspected. "I'm expecting. We're going to have a baby." For a long moment, Nathan said absolutely nothing at all. He simply stood there, completely still, his hands gripping hers. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something so raw and overwhelming that Evelyn watched it break across his face in real time. "A baby," he repeated, like the words didn't quite fit in his mouth yet. "Evelyn, are you certain?" "Quite certain." The doctor confirmed it. And then, without any warning at all, Nathan Walker, the man who had survived a war, buried a wife, lost a barn to fire, and nearly lost his own life beneath a burning beam, the man who had told her once that he'd spent 10 years believing the best parts of his life were behind him, broke down completely in the middle of the yard, tears streaming freely down his face, his shoulders shaking with something that was not grief at all, but the purest, most overwhelming joy Evelyn had ever witnessed in another human being. "Nathan, I'm sorry, I just—" He pulled her into his arms, careful and fierce all at once, his face buried against her hair. "I never let myself believe I'd get this. After Sarah, after everything, I made my peace with the idea that this particular kind of happiness simply wasn't meant for me. I told myself I'd accepted it. And now you're standing here telling me," his voice broke entirely, "we're going to have a child, Evelyn. An actual child. Ours. Ours." She confirmed her own tears falling freely now, both of them standing in the cold afternoon light, holding each other like the ground beneath them might give way if they let go. "I know it frightens you. I know what you lost and what this might stir up. But Nathan, I need you to know this isn't replacing anything. This is something entirely new, something neither of us could have imagined that first day at the depot, when you looked at me and said I wasn't the woman in the photograph." "No!" Nathan agreed, pulling back just enough to look at her properly, his hands cradling her face with a tenderness that had grown only deeper, only steadier in the months since their wedding. "You were never the woman in the photograph, Evelyn. You were always something far better than anything a photograph could have promised me. You were the truth walking toward me when a lie would have been easier. You have been the truth every single day since." The months that followed carried their own quiet rhythm of anticipation. Evelyn's body changed slowly, steadily, and Nathan gruff. Careful Nathan, who had once kept an entire decade of grief locked behind a closed chest in the back room, became to the great amusement of every ranch hand and neighbor in the valley, almost comically attentive, insisting she rest more than she wanted to. Fretting over every small ache, building a cradle with his own 2 hands in the evenings by lamplight, with a focus and tenderness that made Evelyn's chest ache every time she watched him work. "You're going to wear yourself out before the baby even arrives," she told him one evening, watching him sand the edge of the cradle for what had to be the dozenth time. "I want it perfect." "It's already perfect, Nathan. It's been perfect for a week. There's a rough spot right there." He pointed to a section indistinguishable to Evelyn's eye from any other part of the wood. "I won't have our child catching a splinter on something I built with my own hands. I've got one job here, Evelyn. I intend to do it properly." She sat down beside him, resting her head against his shoulder, watching the lamplight flicker over the careful work of his hands, and thought of how far this man had come from the guarded, silent stranger who had met her at that depot with a photograph of someone else, entirely certain that disappointment was the only thing life had left to offer him. "You've already done it properly," she said softly. "You did it the moment you decided to listen to a stranger's truth instead of sending her away. Everything since has just been you proving it over and over in 100 small ways. This cradle is simply the latest." Nathan set down the sandpaper and pulled her closer, his hand resting against the curve of her stomach, where their daughter they had learned through no means more scientific than Mrs. Pruitt's confident prediction that it would very likely be a girl, was growing steadily toward the world. "I keep thinking about that morning at the depot," he admitted quietly. "I keep thinking about how close I came to simply putting you back on that train. If I'd let my disappointment win that day, instead of my curiosity—" "You didn't." "No, I didn't." He pressed a kiss to her temple, his hand still resting protectively over their unborn child. "I think some part of me knew even then, standing there furious and confused, and certain I'd been wronged, that there was something in you worth not walking away from. I just didn't have the words for it yet." "You have them now. I have all of them now, every single one." He turned her gently to face him, his gray eyes no longer the wary, storm-colored eyes of that first meeting, but something softer, something settled, holding hers with absolute certainty. "I love you, Evelyn Walker. I love the truth you walked toward me with. I love the woman who ran into a burning barn because she refused to leave me behind. I love the woman who rode 11 hours round trip to save everything I had left, and the woman who is about to make me a father in a way I genuinely believed I would never get to be. I do not have adequate words for what you have given me. I only have my whole life, and I intend to spend every day of it making certain you know exactly how grateful I am that you were the one who stepped off that stage."
Dad.
Grace Walker was born on a clear morning in early spring, nearly a full year and a half after Evelyn had first watched her sister flee an obligation that became, against every conceivable expectation, the greatest gift either sister had ever received. The labor was long and difficult, and there was a stretch of several hours in the small hours of the night when Nathan paced the length of the front room with a terror in his chest that rivaled anything he'd felt watching that beam come down across his own shoulder, certain he was about to lose everything all over again, the way he'd lost it once before. But when the midwife finally emerged from the bedroom exhausted and smiling, carrying the news that both mother and daughter were healthy, strong, and entirely perfectly fine, Nathan sank into a chair and wept with a relief so total it left him momentarily unable to stand. When he finally held his daughter for the first time, her tiny fist curled instinctively around his rough, work-scarred finger. Nathan Walker, the soldier, the widower, the man who had spent 10 years believing himself permanently locked out of this particular kind of joy, looked down at her with an expression of such pure, unguarded wonder that Evelyn, exhausted and aching and happier than she had ever been in her entire life, found she could not stop watching him. "Grace," he said softly, testing the name they'd chosen together. Hello, Grace. I'm your father. His voice cracked on the word fully completely without a trace of the careful armor he'd once worn against feeling anything too deeply. I never thought I'd get to say that to anyone again. Now you get to say it for the rest of your life, Evelyn murmured from the bed, watching him cradle their daughter with a tenderness that undid her all over again. For the rest of my life, he repeated like a vow renewed, and crossed the room to sit beside her. Grace held securely against his chest, his free hand finding Evelyn's and holding it tightly. I keep thinking about everything that had to happen for this exact moment to exist. Your sister running, your father's debt, that stagecoach, that depot, that ridiculous photograph that wasn't you. He shook his head slowly, wonder still written plainly across every line of his face. I used to think the worst thing that ever happened to me was losing Sarah. I don't think that anymore. I think the worst thing that happened to me was believing for 10 long years that I didn't deserve to feel like this again. You deserved it the whole time, Nathan. You just needed someone willing to tell you the truth until you finally believed it. I got exactly that. He looked down at Grace, then up at Evelyn, his eyes bright with everything he no longer had to hide. I got exactly the right someone. Word reached Charlotte within the week, and she arrived at the ranch 10 days later with a small, carefully wrapped gift, and tears already standing in her eyes before she'd even crossed the threshold, scooping her tiny niece into her arms with a reverence that spoke to exactly how far she herself had traveled. Since that terrible morning she'd run from her own obligations and left her sister to carry them instead. She's perfect, Evie. She's absolutely perfect. Charlotte looked up, her expression suddenly serious, in a way it rarely was. I used to think I'd been the lucky one, free of the marriage, free of the obligation, free to chase whatever I wanted without anyone telling me no. She looked around the warm, lived-in house at Nathan, watching his daughter with open adoration, at her sister glowing with a contentment Charlotte had never once seen on her growing up. I don't think that anymore. I think you're the one who found something real. Evie and I spent so long running from obligation that I very nearly ran straight past the chance to ever have something this true for myself. It's not too late for you, Charlotte. No, Charlotte agreed softly, looking down at her tiny niece with something like hope dawning in her own eyes. I don't think it is. I think I finally understand what to look for now. I think watching you build this taught me more about what real love actually looks like than anything I ever imagined for myself back in Missouri. The two sisters sat together that evening, Grace asleep between them, and talked long into the night, the way they never quite had as girls, the old resentments finally fully laid to rest, replaced by something neither of them had thought possible. Just a year and a half before. Genuine closeness, hard-won and honest, built the same way Evelyn had built everything else in her new life, through truth, through patience, through the simple, stubborn choice to keep showing up for each other, no matter what it cost. Bende. Years later, when Grace was old enough to ask about how her parents had met Nathan, would tell the story the same way every time, sitting on the porch with his daughter on his knee, Evelyn nearby with her hands busy in some piece of mending, listening with quiet contentment to a story she had lived but never tired of hearing, told back to her. Your mother stepped off a stagecoach wearing another woman's promise. He'd say, and instead of pretending to be someone she wasn't, she looked me dead in the eye and told me the truth, even knowing it might cost her everything. I've built my whole life around that one moment, Gracie. The moment your mother chose honesty, when a lie would have been so much easier. And you didn't send her away, Grace would say every time, because she loved this part most of all. No. Nathan would agree every time, his hand finding Evelyn's across the porch, the same way it had found hers that very first night by the fire, when he'd finally let himself say what he felt. I didn't send her away. It turned out to be the best decision I ever made in my entire life. The ranch thrived in the years that followed. The barn standing strong, the herd growing, the house filled permanently now, with warmth and laughter, and the steady, accumulated evidence of a love that had been built not on a photograph or a contract or anyone else's promise, but on something far sturdier. Two people who had chosen, day after day, year after year, to keep choosing each other, even when nothing was forcing their hand at all. Nathan Walker had once believed that surviving was the most life could offer a man who had already lost everything that mattered. He knew better now, holding his daughter beneath the endless Wyoming sky, his wife beside him, the home they had built together, standing solid against whatever storms still lay ahead. He had not simply survived. He had been saved not by fate, not by circumstance, but by one woman's unbreakable refusal to lie her way into an easier life, and by his own willingness. At the moment it mattered most to choose truth over disappointment, hope over silence, and love over everything the war had once told him he would never deserve again. That, in the end, was the whole of the story. A miracle bestowed upon him by chance, but a love earned deliberately and completely by two people who refused to settle for anything less than the truth between them, and it was a truth that would carry them unshaken for the rest of their days. Grace was 9 years old the summer the drought came, and it was the first hardship she was old enough to truly understand, old enough to watch her parents' faces for signs of fear. The way children do when they sense the adults around them are frightened of something they can't fix with a hug or a bedtime story. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property had been shrinking for weeks, the grass turning brittle and pale under a sky that refused day after day to deliver the rain everyone kept watching for. Nathan rode the fence line every morning now, instead of every few days. His jaw tight in the way Evelyn had learned over 11 years of marriage meant he was doing arithmetic in his head that he didn't like the answer to. "How bad?" she asked him one evening after Grace had gone up to bed, and the house had settled into the particular quiet that belonged only to the two of them. "Bad enough." Nathan rubbed a hand across his face, the gesture of a man older now, weathered by more good years than hard ones, but still carrying the same careful honesty he'd offered her on a wagon ride 11 years before. "If we don't get rain in the next 3 weeks, we'll have to sell off a third of the herd just to keep the rest fed through what's left of summer." "Then we'll sell a third of the herd." "Evelyn, we have survived worse than a dry summer, Nathan Walker." She said it lightly, but there was steel underneath it, the same steel that had once stood in a depot and refused to look away from a stranger's disappointment. "We survived a fire that took the whole barn. We survived Silas Harper trying to steal this land out from under us with a piece of forged paper. I think we can survive a summer that simply forgot how to rain." He almost smiled at that, the worry in his face loosening just slightly. "You always did have a way of making the worst things sound manageable." "That's because most things are manageable once you stop being afraid to look at them directly." She reached across the table and took his hand. The same gesture she'd made 100 times over the years in good seasons and hard ones alike. "We'll figure it out. We always do." What neither of them expected was that Grace herself would be the one to figure out the first piece of it. She had been quietly absorbing every worried conversation, every clipped exchange about water levels and feed costs, in the particular way children do when adults think they aren't listening, and one morning at breakfast, she set down her fork with the deliberate seriousness of a child about to say something she'd clearly been rehearsing. "Papa, why don't we dig a new well closer to the north pasture?" Mr. Pruitt's boy said his family dug one last year past the old fence line and struck water deeper down, even though the creek by them dried up same as ours. Nathan and Evelyn exchanged a look over their daughter's head, the kind of look that carried an entire silent conversation in it. "That's not a bad thought, Gracie," Nathan said slowly. "Where exactly did the Pruitts dig?" "Past the line of cottonwoods where the ground stays a little greener even when everything else goes brown. I noticed it on the way to the schoolhouse. The grass there doesn't die as fast as the grass everywhere else." Evelyn felt something warm and proud bloom in her chest, watching her daughter explain herself with the same careful, observant logic that had once carried her own mother 1,100 miles west into a stranger's life, and out the other side of it transformed. "You've been paying closer attention to this land than I gave you credit for," Nathan said, and Grace's face lit with the particular pride of a child whose competence had just been noticed and taken seriously by a parent. "I pay attention to everything, Papa. Mama says that's how she figured out Mr. Harper was lying all those years ago. She says the truth is usually sitting right where everyone's too busy, or too scared to look. Nathan's eyes met Evelyn's across the table, something tender and a little awestruck passing between them. The particular wonder of watching the values you'd built your whole marriage on take root unprompted in a child who had absorbed them simply by growing up inside a house where honesty had always mattered more than comfort. "Your mother is usually right about those things," Nathan said. "Let's go take a look at that ground past the cottonwoods, the both of us. Maybe you'll grow up to run this ranch better than I ever did. Can I really come? You found the spot. Seems only fair you're there when we test whether you're right." The well, when they finally dug it 3 weeks later with help from 2 neighboring families, who remembered exactly who had once stood up to Silas Harper on their behalf, struck water at just under 30 feet clean. Steady, plentiful water that would carry the herd through the worst of the drought, and as it turned out, through several dry summers still to come in the years ahead. Nathan stood at the edge of that new well with his daughter beside him, both of them soaked from the spray of the test pump, laughing in a way that had nothing performed or careful about it. And Evelyn watched them from the porch, with her hand pressed against her chest, thinking of every hard year that had led to this single, easy, joyful moment. "She takes after you," Nathan said that night, settling into bed beside her, the exhaustion of the day's digging still heavy in his shoulders. That same way of looking straight at a problem instead of flinching from it. "She takes after both of us, I think. You taught her patience. I taught her to keep her eyes open." Evelyn turned to face him in the dark, the same dark that had once held nothing but a locked chest and a decade of grief now holding instead the steady, accumulated warmth of a marriage built brick by brick on choosing each other. "Do you ever think about that morning at the depot? How close we both came to none of this existing at all. More often than you'd think." Nathan's voice had gone soft, reflective. "I think about it every time something hard happens and we get through it anyway. I think this almost wasn't mine to have. And then I remember it is, and I try not to take a single day of it for granted." The drought broke in late August, the rain finally coming in a long, steady soak that left the whole valley smelling of wet earth and relief, and that same week brought a letter from Charlotte that changed the shape of the family yet again. She had married a quiet, steady schoolteacher from a town 2 counties over, a man entirely unlike the romantic notions Charlotte had once chased as a girl, and the letter was full of an unguarded happiness that Evelyn read twice through, smiling the whole way. "I used to think love needed to feel like running towards something thrilling," Charlotte wrote. "I understand now it's supposed to feel like finally being able to stop running at all. I learned that from watching you and Nathan all these years, Evie, more than I think you ever realized. Thank you for being patient with me long enough for me to finally understand it." Evelyn read the letter aloud to Nathan that evening, her voice catching at the final lines, and Nathan reached over and squeezed her hand, the gesture as familiar now as breathing. "She finally got there," he said. "She finally got there," Evelyn agreed. "I'm glad. I spent so many years thinking the two of us were opposites, the sensible one and the reckless one, the overlooked one and the favored one. I don't think that was ever quite true. I think we were just 2 women learning the same lesson at very different speeds." "And what lesson is that?" "That the love worth having is never the one that's handed to you easiest. It's the one you choose deliberately on the hard days as much as the easy ones." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the well-dug, the drought-broken the daughter they'd built together asleep down the hall. "I learned that on a stagecoach heading toward a man I'd never met. I don't think I ever stopped learning it honestly. I think that's simply what a good marriage is, relearning the same true thing over and over for the rest of your life." Nicky Bag. Grace grew up fast after that, the way children on working ranches always seemed to capable with horses, before she was capable with cursive, fluent in the rhythms of planting and branding and mending fence, long before she ever needed any of those skills for survival, the way her mother once had. But it was a different kind of survival. Evelyn watched her daughter inherit, not the desperate, sacrificial survival of a girl handed an impossible obligation, but something gentler and infinitely more durable. The simple, steady confidence of a child who had never once doubted she was wanted exactly as she was. It was the spring. Grace turned 13, that she finally asked the question Evelyn had always known was coming, the one that required an answer more complicated than the version Nathan told so easily on the porch. "Mama, were you scared? Getting on that stagecoach not knowing if Papa would even let you stay?" Evelyn set down the mending in her lap and considered the question seriously, the way she'd always tried to answer her daughter's questions, without the soft edges adults sometimes gave to hard truths. "Terrified," she admitted. "I had never been further than the next county over in my entire life, and I was traveling 1,100 miles to marry a stranger who had every right to send me home the moment he realized I wasn't the woman he'd been promised." "Then why did you go?" "Because somebody had to keep their word, and it had stopped being my sister's word to keep." Evelyn reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her daughter's, the same small gesture Nathan had once offered her all those years ago in a kitchen lit by lamplight and uncertainty. "But Gracie, I want you to understand something important because I think it matters more than the fear did. I went because some part of me, some part I didn't even fully recognize at the time, wanted to find out who I was when nobody was telling me to be smaller or quieter or more convenient than I actually was. I think I'd spent my whole life up to that point being whatever everyone else needed me to be. That stagecoach was terrifying. It was also the first time I ever got to simply be myself with nothing to lose by it." "And you found Papa?" "I found your father. But Gracie, I want to be very clear with you. Finding your father wasn't the miracle. The miracle was that I finally stopped being afraid to tell the truth about who I was, even when the truth was inconvenient, even when a lie would have been so much easier. Your father just happened to be the kind of man who recognized that truth as something worth keeping, instead of something to be afraid of." Grace was quiet for a long moment, turning the words over with the same careful attention she gave everything, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had a thoughtful weight to it that made Evelyn's chest ache with a tender, fierce pride. "I think that's why I'm not scared of anything, Mama. Because you and Papa never made me feel like I had to pretend to be someone easier to want." Evelyn pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tightly, thinking of every quiet sacrifice of her own girlhood, every moment she'd folded herself smaller, to keep the peace and feeling in this single instant that all of it, the stagecoach, the depot, the fire, the fraud, every hard year in between, had been worth enduring simply to make certain her own daughter never had to learn that particular lesson the hard way. "Good," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "Don't ever let anyone teach you otherwise." Nathan found them like that on the porch as the sun went down. Mother and daughter wrapped around each other in the gold evening light, and he stood in the doorway a long moment, without announcing himself, simply watching the same way he'd once watched Evelyn transform his cold, silent house into something warm enough to finally call home. He thought, as he often still did after all these years, of that morning at the depot. The photograph in his hand, the stranger walking toward him, instead of the bride he'd been promised the moment he'd had every reason in the world to turn away, and every instinct telling him not to. He had chosen not to turn away. It remained all these years later the single best decision of his entire life, and watching his wife and daughter now wrapped together in the dying light of another hard-won, ordinary, extraordinary day. Nathan Walker understood with complete and unshakable certainty that some men spent their whole lives waiting for a miracle to arrive from somewhere far away, never realizing that sometimes the miracle simply steps off a stagecoach, tells you the truth when a lie would serve her better, and asks for nothing in return but the chance to be seen exactly as she is. He had been given that chance. He had never once in all the years since regretted taking it.